what the Trump administration has been saying about raising tariffs on many products. It raises a question, therefore, not only of tariffs, but the economy. In terms of the economy, global economy, what does the the Trump administration think? Alistair Crook. Alistair Crook is a former British ambassador, belongs to a group called the Conflicts Forum. And in this regard, talking about the economy, he makes an interesting proposition. And he writes that the post-World War II geopolitical outcome effectively determined the post-war global economic structure. And says both are now undergoing huge change. And he says the U.S. has been forced into two major conclusions. First, that the budget deficit coupled with exploding federal debt finally has turned the resource curse back onto the United States. As the keeper of the global reserve currency, it has necessarily made America's primordial export to become the US dollar. And by extension, it means that the strong dollar, buoyed by a global synthetic demand for the reserve currency, has eviscerated America's real economy, its manufacturing base. And he says this is the Dutch disease, whereby currency appreciation suppresses the development of productive export sectors. And the dollar's global role contributed to the financialization at the expense of investment in the real economy. And says that the reserve currency, and consequently the strong dollar, has pushed, which is very interesting, has pushed many U.S. military supply lines out to China. And he said, the Pentagon says it makes no sense for the U.S. to depend on Chinese supply lines to provide the inputs to U.S. military manufactured weapons. And the U.S. administration has two answers to this conundrum. It's to weaken the value of the dollar and therefore to increase the value of the partners' status currencies. And he says the U.S. solution is to force the rest of the world to appreciate their currencies in order to improve the U.S. export competitiveness. And he says the second option is a unilateral approach. In this approach, a user fee on foreign official holdings of U.S. treasuries would be imposed to drive the reserve managers out of the dollar and thus weaken it. And he says a U.S. economic rebalancing is coming. And says Putin is right. The post-World War II economic order is gone. This analysis may be right or wrong, but I think the size of the issues it's raising concerning a country which can make still a major impact on the global economy are very important, and therefore emphasizing the need to understand the global economic objectives of the Trump administration. Alistair Crook said that Putin was right. The old economic order was on the way out, creating new possibilities. And he talks about what Putin said earlier this month when he addressed the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. He was talking about Russia. in the context of this economic world order that is on its way out. He says sanctions are neither temporary nor targeted measures. They constitute a mechanism of systemic, strategic pressure against our nation. Regardless of global developments or shifts in the international order, our competitors will perpetually seek to constrain Russia and diminish its economic and technological capacities. And this, as I reiterate, sanctions and restrictions are the reality of the existing new stage of development that the entire world, the entire global economy has entered. The global competitive struggle has intensified, assuming increasingly sophisticated and uncompromising forms. But the so-called Western dominance is slipping away, and new global growth centers taking the center stage is a long-term trend. And I want to emphasize that. Yes, of course, we are fully aware of the advantages offered by our so-called Western partners, such as advanced technology and production process organization. We should keep in mind that growth rates in various regions of the world will remain stable over the next several decades. And the fact that we have, to a certain extent, refocused our priorities, not through our fault, by the way, due to a number of circumstances, may be a good thing. We are shifting our focus to global promising markets. All things that we need, we will get one way or another. Of course, he says, this long-term trend will remain unchanged. It will be bolstered up by, among others, the BRICS development platform that is currently taking shape. What Putin is arguing here is that despite all obstacles, essentially because the old order in the economy globally no longer holds, as Alistair Crooks said, Russia will succeed. What's our reading, Minister, about this? Is the world order, the old order, the economic order, on the way out? Is Putin and Alistair Crooks, are they correct? And where does that position us and position the African continent, if that in fact is a reality? Some have correctly suggested that despite this changing world, it is still necessary to make an objective assessment of the power of the United States, given its prominent economic, technological, and military standing globally. And in this regard, the US professor Paul Post wrote in January this year and said that some might question whether the US is still the world's hegemonic power or the key country that can shape and alter the course of international politics. If it's not, then Trump's behavior, while concerning, can be dismissed as the flailing of a declining power. But even if the US is still not hegemonic, much of the world, be it nations of the Western Hemisphere, residing directly in the US orbit, the network of allies that rely on US protection, or international institutions that rely on US support to function, still view the US as a central actor in the world. Moreover, the US remains one of the few countries in the world with the power and resources largely to shape world politics in a manner that serves its interests. It would seem to be a wasted opportunity not to, unquote. The US professor Paul Post said this early this year. It was followed by another US thinker, Connor Eccles, who wrote under the heading, Trump's Power Problem. and said whether Trump likes it or not, this is now Connor Eccles, whether Trump likes it or not, the unipolar movement, that brief post-Cold War period of true American primacy, is over, particularly in economic terms, and Washington's leverage is an easy resource to squander. Trump can get modest short-term wins by threatening sudden economic shocks, but over the long term, countries will try to limit their exposure to a volatile trading partner. And he said for most of the post-World War II era, America has used its status as a dominant global economic power to shape the rules of trade and hem in its adversaries. That power is still huge, but preserving it depends on a certain level of restraint, especially given all the other powerful states in the game today. The more that Washington hits other countries with sanctions or tariffs, the more it encourages other states to find ways to cut their ties to the American economy. And he says Washington's economic sword, once the world's sharpest, is growing dull through 1,000 mindless blows, unquote. Professor Paul Post himself concludes that the U.S. under Trump appears bent on fully leveraging its outsized position within the world's trade, security, and financial networks to coerce better deals. If others don't like it, they won't even be given the dignity of a kind word. The U.S., in Trump's view, has been played for a sucker and is determined to change all that. And he says Trump also strives in being highly transactional. And this will tilt the U.S. towards being more a predatory hegemon in the coming years, one that destabilizes and disturbs more than it comforts. But it also won't be fully outside the bounds of how the U.S. was long perceived by others, unquote. And South Africa itself, of course, has been exposed to some action by the Trump administration. The challenge remains. With all these various assessments of what the Trump administration stands for, how should we relate to the U.S. under the Trump administration? In my view, not a very straightforward matter, but I believe that in this regard, DIRCO must give us the lead. As Aziz insisted, we are seeing the emergence of a multipolar world to which Anjana here referred. The issues we've been discussing are part of that multipolarity. And many were surprised when the new U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said during an interview on the 30th of January this year, and I quote, "So it's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. It was a product of the end of the Cold War, but eventually you are going to reach back to a point, where you had a multipolar world, multi-great powers in different parts of the planet." He said, we face that now with China and to some extent Russia, and then you have rogue states like Iran and North Korea that you have to deal with, unquote. In the same interview, he said that the way the world has always worked is that the Chinese will do what's in the best interest of China. The Russians will do what's in the best interest of Russia. The Chileans are going to do what is in the best interest of Chile. And the United States needs to do what's in the best interest of the United States, unquote. It seems right Minister, that inspired by what Marco Rubio said, we must also insist that Africa must do what is in the best interest of Africa. It is obvious that an important part